Well, good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for this, for your invitation and giving me the opportunity to explain my understanding of the system related to what you've just addressed, the system of health technology assessment, and how further through the marketing authorization, which is delivered by the competent authorities, the product can or cannot access the market, going through additional stages of evaluations. And I'm going to address this HTA mechanism through one specific example, which was suggested to me by Francois, and I think it's a good idea to base my presentation on one example, taking into account especially the fact that you've already address the issue of the specific product of this example, which is the Nitisinone on Monday morning. I don't know if you remember. So going to the presentation. So the objective is to understand the differences between marketing authorization and the funding decisions, even if they're based on the same data from the same clinical trials, taking into account that health technology assessment is taking into account clinical data from clinical trials, but is also taking into account economical aspects on which, if we have enough time and questions, I could address more specifically at the end of the presentation. So what is important is to understand that marketing authorization for a product does not always mean approval to pay for the public or the private health insurance schemes. And for reasons I hope we will together better understand at the end of this presentation. On the basis of the Nitisinone case study, I'll try to demonstrate why it's not automatic. Just to understand the specific context of the example, Nitisinone is a product which initially has been developed as a herbicide, but as many chemical products could have many different interesting applications and uses. And it happened that this product appeared interesting in some diseases, and specifically in genetic disorders, and two of them, which involves a specific alteration of enzymes. And on this slide, you can see the cascade of reactions through which the initial amino acid, which is called phenylalanine, is going through. So there is a metabolization through enzymes of this amino acid. Phenylalanine is transformed in tyrosine, then in different acids, and the disease of interest for this presentation, which is alkaptonuria, which is one of the two indications which were approved for marketing authorization. Alkaptonuria is related to mutation in a specific gene coding for a specific enzyme, which is the homogentisate deoxygenase, the HGT. And when there is such mutation, there is accumulation of the product, which is the substrate of this enzyme, which is the homogentisic acid. And the consequence of the accumulation of this acid is the development of the disease, which is called alkaptonuria. This acid is at the origin of the accumulation of deposits in tissues and at the origin of the damages which is observed in this disease. We can observe it of this acid, and also, which is more significant in terms of clinical consequences, damages which could in different organs and in joints in particular, but not only in joints, but also, for example, at the cardiac valvular level. This product, Nitisinone, is blocking the enzyme which is producing this acid, and then by consequence, by limiting the production in patients of this homogentisic acid, we could diminish the level of the accumulation of these deposits and then logically diminish the impact in terms of organ damages which are observed in this disease. This is the basic logic and on the basis of the development of this product. So as I said, nitisinone was initially developed in another genetic disease, which is the HT1, hereditary tyrosinemia type 1, for which the sponsor and the applicants of the marketing authorization obtain marketing authorization in the EU in 2005. And concerning the specific disease of interest in this presentation, the AKU, alkaptonuria, which is before the application for marketing authorization, so orphan designation in the EU for this product in this medical condition, the AKU was obtained in 2002, 20 years ago. And what is interesting in this example is that the sponsor of the clinical developments adopted a very complete, exhaustive way to interact with the authorities in order to maximize the chance of positive results in terms of clinical development and marketing authorization. So the sponsor went to the authorities, and in particular to the EMA, for scientific advice before the clinical study we've gone through on Monday, the SONIA 2 study, and I'm going to present again some key elements of this study in a few minutes. So they went to the EMA to validate the clinical study in this specific indication before marketing authorization. They also succeeded in obtaining EU funds, public funds, to develop and to fund the clinical trial and the clinical development of these products. And at the end, they obtained, after application of marketing authorization, CHMP positive opinion. Recently, it went in 2 years ago, in the specific indication of treatment of adult patients with AKU. And the product has been developed, and the marketing authorization was obtained by the Swedish orphan Vitrum International AB company, and it was under the trade name of Orfadin. As you know, and it has been addressed on Monday, this clinical trial, the key pivotal clinical trial, phase 3 clinical trial, has been published in an important journal with a high level of validity in terms of once the publication is accepted in such journal, it means that it went through a peer review process, and the level of confidence we can have in the methodology and the quality of the data was by default very high, because it has been published in such a high level journal, which is Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. It has been published in 2020. And this publication, which is related to the phase 3 clinical trial, is related to the trial SONIA 2, which followed a phase 2 clinical trial, SONIA 1, which was aimed to, in particular, evaluate the adequate dose to apply for testing the product in phase 3 study. So a very classic development in difficult circumstances, of course, because it's a rare disease, so the recruitment is difficult, and the sponsor had to deal with a limited number of patients to include in the clinical trial. So the phase 3 clinical study was conducted in UK, in France, and Slovakia, and we saw that some patients were even recruited from Jordan. And one important element was the fact that the eligible patients for this clinical trial were adults of and were aged 25 years older, and we will see that this is one of the elements important to consider concerning the way the patients responded to treatment. So these patients, in order to be included, were 25 years old or older with a confirmed diagnosis of the disease, and in order to be included, had presents a clinical manifestation in addition to the biological anomalies, which is the characteristic of the disease, the increase of the plasmatic and urinary levels of this homogeneistic acid, but they had to present already a clinical manifestation. They were randomized between two groups. So the methodology was very adapted to a phase 3 clinical trial with two groups, a randomization between one group with the treatment tested and another without the treatment tested, but with patients treated with the best care available at that time. And as we've seen on Monday, it was difficult to organize and even impossible to be in a double-blind situation, because in particular, they had patients presented a specific color of the urine, and the impact of the treatment with Nitisinone had changed, had an impact on this color, so it was impossible to be blinded. But in compensation to this absence of blind, the sponsor proposed to have evaluators of the effects of the treatment in patients made by clinical evaluators, which did not meet the patients, but had to evaluate on the basis of data collected by investigators in contact with patients, but the evaluators by themselves in charge of evaluating the data were not in direct contact with the patient. So in terms of methodology, and I suspect in terms also in terms of consultation to the authorities, everything was done in a right way and the best way. Concerning a key element of the methodology and the outcome measures, the main criteria for evaluation was biological, was the measure of the expression on 24 hours in the urine of this excessive level of acid, HTA, in patients at month 12. So it was also a long study on 4 years. So it was, in terms of methodology, this is also very positive to have a long-term follow-up of patients. There were many secondary endpoints. As usual in phase 3 clinical trial, we have the main criteria, which is key in terms of statistical and clinical evaluation. And there are lots of secondary endpoints. And strictly speaking, these secondary endpoints should not be considered to conclude in terms of effect of the product, but could be very indicative of future developments and are called exploratory and not at the basis of the conclusion of the clinical trial. And amongst the secondary endpoints, as you can see, there were some of them of very high relevance, and in particular in terms of clinical evaluation and quality of life. The timing of the data collection was very adequate, with visits on a regular basis and with a follow-up on 4 years. One point on which we will quickly go back in terms of results is the two criteria which are called C-accuracy and M-accuracy, which are clinical evaluation criteria. C-accuracy and is a criteria which is based on many different clinical features. C-accuracy stands for Clinical AQ Severity Score Index. And you can see on this table, which appears on the EPAR, the public documents available from the EMA, and which is the European Public Assessment Report. This criteria is a composite criteria, which is related to many different clinical observations. Some of them which are purely morphologic, for example, the fact that there is a specific color or deposit on some tissues. Other are more functional, and for example, are related to tendon rupture or fracture, which have, of course, a functional consequence and are more relevant than the fact that you could have specific crystals, colored crystals in, for example, at the level of an ear. So this is also something to consider. Another observations to have concerning these criteria is the fact that the maximum score, so each criteria is evaluated with a number corresponding on the weight in the composite score. For example, if you have bone density, which is decreased at the level of the hip, you can see that you have a score which varies according to the bone density from 0 to 6. So there are lots of numbers to add. And the maximum score of this CAQC is 204. And we will see quickly that this is also something very important. So you can go from a very low score to a maximum score, which is 204, without additional values related to arthroscopies or joint replacement, which adds each of them additional numbers. So it can go beyond this number of 2004. Very quickly, 139 patients were assessed, 138 were randomized. It was a balanced randomization with 69 patients allocated in each group. And the follow-up was very balanced in terms of what the patients become during the clinical trial. As you can see, in all clinical trials, we have patients which are lost to follow-up. We have patients who can discontinue their participations, and you can see that it's balanced between the groups. So it's not very worrying in terms of results. Of course, we have in clinical trials to investigate the reason why they discontinue. For example, it could be due to adverse events in one group and other reasons in the other group. But broadly speaking, concerning this figure, we are quite reassured on the balance of numbers, even if the quality or the reasons behind the numbers could be different. The characteristics, it's from the publication, the characteristics of the patients were also comparable. Even if we randomize, we can have sometimes, especially when the number of patients is relatively limited, we can have unbalanced characteristics, and we have to check these characteristics of patients at the moment of the inclusion. You can see that the ages, the weight, and other characteristics are quite equivalent between the groups. It is, by the way, interesting there, and we'll see that later, that the average age of the patients was around nearly 50. And the results, and we've seen that on Monday, were striking, positively striking in terms of primary endpoint. The daily urinary expression of the homogenesic acid were very different between the groups. And we can see on the two figures, which is urinary expression and the plasma levels, are very different at the end on the primary endpoint. So after 1 year of treatment, we can observe that the product had important impacts, striking impact on the metabolization of the phenylalanine and tyrosine in the bodies of the patients treated with nitisinone. We still have high level of the product, which is at the origin of the disease in the patients in the control group, and we have a low level and the scale is logarithmic, so it's a very important difference of levels between the two groups, and pharmacologically it's very positive. But when we go, and this is where the presentation hopefully becomes to be interesting, when we go to the details of the results, it's less striking. In blue circle, inside the blue circles, you can see key elements of results in terms of clinical data. If you look at the accuracy, which is the key clinical score applied to measure the status of these patients, after 4 years of treatment, so at the end of the follow-up of these patients, the C accuracy score is significant different. There is a significant difference between the results and the C accuracy score at the end of this follow-up period. We have a difference of 8.6 between the groups. But remember, the scale goes beyond 200. So we can wonder what this level of difference of 8 is representing in clinical terms for these patients. And a point which is even more worrying is the fact that if we subtract in this score the elements which are related to morphologic observations, and we keep only functional elements, then this significance disappear. The M accuracy score, if I go back to the definition and the description of the score, the C accuracy encompasses morphologic and functional elements. And if we subtract, and this is what appears in the footnote, M accuracy is the C accuracy without measure of pigmentation features. So if we subtract the pigmentation features, so the morphologic features, from the C accuracy score, and we keep functional measuring, the functional impact of the treatment, we see no difference. 66.7 versus 66.1. And even if we go back to the C accuracy score, and if we look what we call the confidence interval, because we have always to look to the value, the average value of the difference, which is there minus 8.6. But if we look carefully at the confidence interval, this confidence interval goes from minus 16 to minus 1.2, which means that we know that when we say that there is a difference, and with a level of error which is by convention of 5%, we know that this difference is between these two limits, which means that in reality the difference could be minus 1.2. So this is really not significant, minus 1.2 when we compare it to the total score of more than 200. This is not significant, clinically significant. So, just to underline the fact that we have always, in addition to the average results, to see the confidence interval, which is the statistical evaluation of the margin of precision. If I can express myself, it's not the exact definition, but we have always to look at confidence to say with confidence what is the limits of the information the clinical trial is providing. When we go to the individual accuracy items, we have confirmation of this observation. The only data which appear to be significantly different between the groups are those related to ochronosis, so the pigmentation. The eye ochronosis and the ear ochronosis. So in fact, the only difference we observe in clinical terms is related to morphologic and not functional parts of the score. This is what I underline in this slide. And indeed, if we look at other figures which appear in the publication, and that has also been underlined on Monday, we see very disappointing results in terms of clinical results. Disappointing results in terms of efficacy, functional, clinically relevant efficacy. And when we look to adverse events, we observe that the treatment can be at the origin of some adverse events. And amongst them, we have, and it's not rare, you can see that around a fourth of the patients presented at least one study drug-related adverse event. And for some of them, the dose of the product, the intake, the daily intake has to be decreased, but with a limited effect of this decrease of dosage from 10 to 2 milligram each day. So at the end, the primary endpoint was by design biological, and obviously does not appear correlated with clinical benefits. The results were positive in terms of C accuracy, but only based on morphologic elements. And in addition, we have to recall ourselves that when a clinical trial is designed, the clinical trial is designed for answering to a specific primary endpoint. Secondary endpoints, strictly speaking, are only exploratory and could, if they are positive, conduct to additional studies in order to confirm the results. So even if the difference in C accuracy or M accuracy, hypothetically, if they were positive, we would then have to conclude very cautiously and continue the observations. Other elements were sources of questions concerning this clinical trial. In these patients, and those of you familiar with this condition, know that one way to deal with these patients is to control the diet. It's very difficult. Observance compliance could be very variable, but one obvious element of attempt to control the disease is to limit the protein intake because the disease is related to the level of specific amino acids in the diet of the patients. And in these patients, we had no control and even no measurement of this aspect of the life of the patients and the diet, which is essential in this disease. So we don't know exactly if concerning the diet, the groups were comparable or not. And we've seen that amongst the secondary endpoints, there was one which is very important related to quality of life of patients. And in the article, we had no result even concerning what has been observed in quality of life. There is mention of it concerning the trends, and I don't remember exactly the exact wording, but it was very prudent from the writers and the authors of these of this article. They wrote it in a way that they observe a trend, but we have no detail, and we had no evidence of improvement of quality of life. And in addition, we had more adverse events under treatment. So at the end, I'm afraid that the conclusion is negative for this study, even if the authors were very enthusiastic in conducting, and even if all the conditions were appropriate to conduct a high quality and the clinical trial. And this clinical trial was really a good clinical trial and validated with all the processes applicable before the start of the clinical trial. But again, no results in terms of clinical improvements. And if we go back to the publication, the authors stated that the direct cause of morbidity in alkaptonuria is the accumulation of this acid, HTA, resulting from the genetic homogentisate dioxygenase deficiency we've seen at the beginning of the presentation. And they write that HTA is therefore a surrogate for clinical meaningful endpoint clinical trials. So the jump from a surrogate biological endpoint, which is the level of HGA in urine or plasma, from this level of plasmatic or urinary acid to a clinical meaningful endpoint. They're probably right, but that has not been proved and established and published in concerning the type of patients included. And the key question is it applicable to adults where lesions are already sufficiently established? Again, the patients, and this is the reason why I underline this point, the patients included in this clinical trial were already adults. SONIA 2 included patients with the age of minimum 25. And the first non-symptomatic lesions are probably developing well before this age and well before the first symptoms. So that could explain why the results were negative. And if we go back to the preclinical experimentations, there was one publication quite recent from Keenan, which showed that administration of nitisinone in the mice model of this disease stops the deposition of the pigments in joints, but did not result in the clearance of existing deposits. So perhaps the reason why this clinical trial was negative was that it was applied and included patients too old to expect a positive result. And this is something which has been relayed in different or already expressed in different publications. And for example, this one where we can read that the first symptoms with pain, debilitating arthritis, cardiac valvular disease, prostate stones can appear before the first lesions are well before the age of 25. So the question was perhaps related to the target population in terms of age. And it's interesting to know that there is also the sign that information that there was a plan to develop this product for younger ages for which a PIP was expected, a pediatric investigation plan. So just to finish my presentation and to ask yourself, based on this data and considering what has been presented, and just to be in a situation where you have to answer to the question as member of committee and only on the clinical part of the data, are you convinced that clinical benefit has been established for the population of patients as defined by the marketing authorization? So considering what we've heard on Monday, considering what I've tried to convene as information related to this clinical trial, do you think that based on this data, you're convinced that the clinical benefit is established? Yes or no? Or you can, as all members can in scientific committees, abstain